You told yourself it didn't cost you anything. That's usually how the story starts. It was just casual, just fun, just two adults doing what adults do. No strings, no expectations, no complications. You were clear about what it was. They were clear about what it was. Nobody got hurt. And maybe that's true. Maybe for some of those situations, that's the complete and accurate account of what happened. But for a lot of people, if they're being completely honest, something did happen. Something quiet, something that doesn't show up immediately and doesn't announce itself loudly. Something that accumulates slowly over time until one day you notice that the way you relate to people has changed. The way you experience intimacy has changed. What you expect from connection has changed. You can't quite trace it back to any single moment because it wasn't a single moment. It was a pattern. A long, gradual, mostly unconscious process of training yourself out of something you were built for. This episode is not an argument for abstinence. It's not a moral position on casual sex. It is not telling you what to do with your body or who to do it with. It's an honest accounting. The tab that accumulates when you separate physical intimacy from emotional connection over time, repeatedly, and tell yourself it isn't costing you anything. But the bill always comes due. It just doesn't always come immediately. Most people don't recognize it when it does. They just notice that something feels different. Something feels harder. Something that used to feel available, real closeness, genuine vulnerability, the ability to let someone in past a certain point has gotten further away. That's what we're talking about today.
Without permission.
This is Without Permission. I'm Chris Willingham, and today we're going to talk about what casual sex is actually costing you, even when you told yourself it was free. Before we go any further, I want to establish something clearly, because I think the term casual sex gets used as a blanket category that covers a very wide range of experiences, and not all of them are the same. There is a version of casual sex that is genuinely low cost. Two people who are grounded, self-aware, and honest with themselves and each other, who have no unspoken expectations, who don't use the encounter as a substitute for something deeper, who engage fully in the moment and walk away intact. That version exists. I'm not pretending it doesn't. But here's what's also true. That version is significantly less common than people claim. Because the claim, I'm fine with casual, I don't want anything more, it doesn't affect me, is often not an accurate description of internal reality. It's a position people adopt, a posture. Sometimes because they genuinely believe it. Sometimes because admitting they want something more feels like weakness. Sometimes because wanting more has been disappointed enough times that not wanting more started to seem like the safer option. So when I talk about the cost of casual sex in this episode, I'm not talking about every single instance of sex between people who aren't in a committed relationship. I'm talking about the pattern, the repeated, extended, primary reliance on physical intimacy without emotional intimacy as a way of meeting connection needs. And the cost of that pattern is real, and it compounds. And it's worth naming directly, even though most people would rather not. Let's start with the biology. I think understanding what's happening chemically changes the frame for people who want to think of casual sex as a purely neutral transaction. During sex, and particularly after orgasm, the brain releases oxytocin. You've probably heard it called the bonding hormone or the attachment hormone, and that's an accurate description, but it undersells what it actually does. Oxytocin doesn't just create a warm feeling. It creates a neurological drive towards the person you just had that experience with. It reinforces the connection. It tags that person as significant in your nervous system. It is literally a bonding mechanism designed by evolution to create attachment between sexual partners and between parents and children. It doesn't ask your permission. It doesn't check whether this is a casual arrangement. It doesn't care what you told each other about expectations. It just does what it does. Now here's where it gets interesting. The oxytocin response is stronger in women on average, but is present in men too. Both people are getting a neurological push towards attachment after sexual contact, regardless of what they agreed to beforehand. So what happens when you have repeated sexual contact with people you have no intention of attaching to? Your nervous system keeps generating the attachment signal, and you keep overriding it. You keep telling the signal, this doesn't mean anything. We're not doing that. Stay on the surface. Do that enough times, and something shifts. The signal starts to quiet. Not because you've become liberated from attachment needs, but because your nervous system has learned, through repeated experience, that the signal is going to be suppressed. So it stops generating it as strongly. The capacity for that neurological bonding response begins to blunt. It's not a metaphor. That's what the research on repeated casual sexual behavior suggests is happening at the neurological level. You are literally training your brain out of its capacity for bonding. And then one day, you meet someone you actually want to attach to, and you find that mechanism doesn't work the way it used to. Something that should feel like more feels like less. The closeness that should be coming doesn't quite arrive, and you don't understand why. That's the oxytocin problem, and nobody's talking about it. Related to the oxytocin problem, but distinct from it, is what happens to your experience of intimacy over time when physical contact is repeatedly separate from emotional connection. Intimacy has layers. There's physical intimacy, the most accessible, the most immediate, the layer that casual sex engages. There's emotional intimacy, the knowing and being known, the exposure of interior life, the vulnerability of letting someone see you as you actually are. There's intellectual intimacy, spiritual intimacy, the kind of closeness that develops through shared experience, through conflict, navigated together, through history. When physical intimacy is consistently available without the other layers, when you can have the most bodily version of closeness with someone who doesn't know your last name or your history or what you're afraid of, the physical layer loses its signal value. It stops pointing towards deeper connection because it's been repeatedly experienced without it. And what that does over time is flatten the experience of intimacy itself. Sex becomes something you do rather than something you share. The body is present. Something else, something that used to be there, some quality of genuine contact, has gone quietly. People describe this in different ways when they're trying to articulate it. I feel like I'm going through the motions. I can be physically with someone and feel completely alone. I don't know how to actually connect anymore. Something that used to feel significant doesn't feel like anything now. That's desensitization, not to sex itself, but what sex was originally designed to carry. The signal has been separated from the meaning so many times that the signal no longer points to the meaning. And the cruelest part of this is that it happens gradually. There's no single moment when you notice it occurring. It's like slowly turning down the volume on something until one day you realize you can't hear it anymore and you can't remember when it got quiet. There's a physical analogy here that I think is genuinely useful. When you repeatedly expose skin to friction, when you work with your hands, when you play guitar, when you run without proper shoes, the skin responds by toughening, building a callus. The callus is a protective response. It makes the skin less sensitive to pain in that area, which is useful when you're trying to prevent injury from repeated contact. The same process happens emotionally. When you repeatedly expose yourself to experiences that carry potential for emotional pain, and you manage that pain by staying surface level, by not attaching, by keeping things casual, your emotional system responds the same way skin does. It toughens. It builds a callus. The callus makes you less sensitive, less effective, less vulnerable to the specific kind of pain that comes from genuine attachment to someone who might not stay, which is the exact pain you were trying to avoid. But the callus doesn't selectively block pain. It blocks sensation, including the sensation of connection, including the capacity to be moved by closeness, including the ability to let someone genuinely touch you. You protected yourself so effectively that you also protected yourself from the thing you were protecting yourself for. This is one of the most significant costs of extended casual sex as a primary relational pattern. And it's one of the least discussed. Not the STI risk, not the reputational dimension, the quiet construction of an emotional barrier that you built so gradually you don't even know it's there until you reach through it and find you can't. Here's something I want you to think about carefully. Human beings are wired for connection. That is not a soft statement. That is a biological fact. Loneliness activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. Social isolation is measurably associated with increased mortality. Connection is not a luxury, it is a survival need. When that need isn't being met, when genuine emotional connection isn't available or doesn't feel safe, the nervous system will accept substitutes, not because it's fooled, because the pressure of the need is strong enough that someone is better than nothing. Casual sex is a very effective short-term substitute for connection. It activates many of the same neurological systems: physical closeness, mutual attention, the sensation of being chosen, if only briefly, shared intensity. For the duration of the encounter, the connection need is partially met. And then it ends, and the need returns, sometimes stronger than before, because the partial satisfaction has primed the system without actually fulfilling it. Like eating something that tastes like food but has no nutritional value. Your stomach is temporarily full, but you're still malnourished. The counterfeit connection is not worthless. It does something real in the short term, but it cannot build the thing the nervous system is actually looking for. Because what the nervous system is looking for is not physical proximity. It's the specific experience of being known by another person who chooses to stay. Casual sex, by definition, does not produce that. It can't. The conditions for it, time, vulnerability, sustained mutual exposure, the working through of conflict, the development of trust, don't exist in the structure of a casual encounter. No matter how present both people are, no matter how genuine the connection feels in the moment. So you keep going back because the need keeps returning, and the counterfeit keeps being the most available option. And the cycle, reach for connection, get the substitute, fill the gap, reach again, runs on and on and on. This one is uncomfortable, and I'm going to say it anyway. Extended casual sex, particularly when it's driven by the regulatory function we talked about in the last episode, tends to lower the threshold for who you're willing to be intimate with. Not because you become less discerning as a person, because the drive for relief doesn't care about discernment. It cares about availability. Over time, you start accepting situations you would have declined before. People who don't actually interest you. Circumstances that feel slightly off. Dynamics that you can feel aren't quite right even as you're moving towards them. Because the pressure of the need is stronger than the hesitation of the discernment. And every time that happens, every time you override your own read on a situation because the drive is louder than the judgment, you deposit something negative into your self-respect account. Not because the sex was wrong, because you didn't listen to yourself and you knew it at the time. That accumulation matters because self-respect is not just a feeling. It's the foundation of how you show up in relationships. People with genuine self-respect make different choices than people who are running on a deficit. They walk away from situations that don't deserve them. They communicate what they actually need. They hold out for the thing that they actually want rather than accepting the closest available approximation. When the self-respect account is depleted, when you've spent years overriding your own better judgment in service of the drive, the capacity for those choices gets weaker. Not gone, but weaker. And rebuilding it requires the uncomfortable work of making different choices before you feel like you're worth making them. That's a hard place to start from, but it is a starting place. I want to spend some specific time here because the cost of the pattern lands differently depending on the cultural context you're navigating it in. And I'm not willing to do the episode without addressing that directly. For Black men, there's a specific cultural permission structure around sexual behavior that functions as both a freedom and a trap. The hypersexualization of Black men by mainstream culture, the stereotype that has been both weaponized against them and sometimes internalized by them, creates a context where high sexual frequency is expected, even celebrated, where being with a lot of women is understood as a masculine achievement rather than a potentially self-destructive pattern. That framing does real damage because it takes a pattern that might otherwise be examined and gives it a social reward structure. The behavior that's costing you emotionally is the behavior that's earning you respect in certain social circles. That makes it extraordinarily hard to question. Because questioning it means questioning an identity. And identity is not something people give up easily. What I want to say directly to Black men specifically, your worth is not your body count. Your masculinity does not require the number. The respect you earn from men who celebrate that number is conditional, thin, and will not be there when you need something real from someone. The version of you that can actually build something lasting in a relationship, in a family, in a life, is not the one being celebrated in those conversations. For Black women, the cost is different, but equally significant. Black women have been simultaneously hypersexualized and desexualized by mainstream culture, both fetishized and rendered invisible depending on the context. The strong Black woman archetype, The one who doesn't need, doesn't ask, handles everything, never shows the softer interior, creates a specific barrier to the kind of vulnerability that genuine intimacy requires. When you've been taught culturally, and sometimes personally, that your softness will be used against you, that needing something makes you a target, casual sex can feel like the safer option. You can be physically present and emotionally protected. You can participate in connection on terms that doesn't expose the interior. The cost of that protection is the same cost I've been describing for everyone. But the reason for it in this context has a specific history that deserves to be named with respect. Safety is a real need. Protection is a real need. And the circumstances that made those adaptations necessary are real. But the adaptation that saved you once can keep costing you long after the original threat is gone. That's worth examining carefully and without judgment. For LGBTQ individuals, and particularly for gay men, the relationship with casual sex has a specific historical and cultural context that I want to address honestly rather than gloss over. The sexual liberation that emerged from the LGBTQ rights movement, particularly in gay male culture in the 70s, was insignificant part a political act, a reclamation of sexuality that had been criminalized, pathologized, and shamed. The freedom to pursue sexual expression openly was hard won. And the culture that developed around it, bathhouses, cruising, high sexual frequency as a form of communal joy and identity affirmation, was not simply hedonism. It was people claiming something that had been violently denied. Then the AIDS crisis arrived, and with it came a specific devastating grief. The loss of an entire generation of gay men, the destruction of communities, the terror of a disease that was allowed to be spread for years, partly because the people dying were not considered worth saving by those in power. The trauma of that period is embedded in gay culture in ways that are still being processed. And some of the sexual behavior patterns that developed in response to it, including the continued separation of sex from emotional risk, make psychological sense as a trauma response. I say all of that to make clear that I understand the context, and I'm not applying the same simple frame to a history that is not simple. What I am saying, with full respect for the context, is that trauma responses have a shelf life, that the adaptation that was intelligent in one set of conditions can keep running in a different set of conditions and produce costs that the original context would not have predicted. That the freedom to pursue sex openly is worth celebrating and protecting, and that the question of what the sex is doing for you, what it's meeting, what it's substituting for, what it's keeping you from, is worth asking regardless of orientation, regardless of history, regardless of cultural identity. The question is not about the sex. It's never been about the sex. It's about you, and that question is available to everyone. Let's slow down for a minute. I want to ask you to do something that might be uncomfortable. Think back over your sexual history, not with judgment, with honesty. Is there a pattern you can see now that you couldn't see while you were inside it? A way of engaging, staying surface level, leaving before it before it could become something, avoiding the conversations that would have made it real, that you now recognize as a habit rather than a preference? Is there a person, or more than one, where something real was available and you moved away from it? Not because the person wasn't right, but because the depth of it scared you and casual was safer. Is there something missing now that used to be present? A quality of feeling, a capacity for being moved, an openness that you noticed has gotten quieter over time? I'm not asking you to regret your choices. I'm asking you to see them clearly. Because you can't make a different choice in the future if you haven't accurately accounted for the choices you've already made. The cost doesn't go away because you don't look at it. It just stays invisible while it keeps accumulating. Here's the specific capacity that takes the heaviest hit from extended casual sexual patterns. And I want to spend some time here because I think it's the one that matters most for the long term. Vulnerability. The willingness to be genuinely seen, to let another person past the presentation and into the actual interior of who you are, to say what you actually feel, to ask for what you actually need, to stay in a relationship through the parts that are uncomfortable rather than retreating to the safety of the surface. Casual sex is structurally a vulnerability-free zone. That's part of its appeal. You get the physical intensity without the emotional exposure. You get the closeness without the risk. You can be completely naked physically while remaining completely covered emotionally. The problem is that vulnerability is a muscle. And like every muscle, it atrophies when it's not used. Extended periods of intimacy that require no emotional exposure leave the vulnerability muscle unused. And then, when you find yourself in a situation that actually requires it, a relationship that's asking you to go deeper, a person who wants to actually know you, the muscle isn't there the way it used to be. You know what you want to say. You can't quite get it out. You feel the pull forward towards closeness and simultaneously the pull away from it. You want the depth and you're afraid of the depth in equal measure. And the fear wins. Not because you decide it should, because the pattern trained it to. And so the relationship stays at the level you can manage, which is the level casual sex trained you for. Surface, controlled, safe, and lonely in the specific way that lonely with someone right there. The vulnerability muscle can be rebuilt. That is genuinely true. It requires different experiences, intentional, repeated, incremental exposure to emotional risk in relational context. Small disclosures that don't kill you. Staying in the discomfort a little longer than the habit wants you to. Choosing depth over safety in small moments until the pattern starts to shift. It is work. It is uncomfortable. And it is completely possible. I want to address something that I hear underneath a lot of the casual is fine for me conversation. A specific idea that I think does a lot of damage. The fantasy of the person who doesn't need anyone. It's a compelling identity. The person who is completely self-sufficient, emotionally independent, never needs anything from anyone, can take or leave connection, doesn't get attached, moves through the world without that particular kind of vulnerability. Some people perform this identity consciously. Others have adopted it so completely they've convinced themselves it's genuinely who they are. Not a posture, a nature. It's not a nature. It's a defense. A very effective one, but a defense. Because the need for connection is not a personality trait. It is a biological imperative. You don't get to not have it anymore than you get to not have the need for food or sleep. What you can do, what a lot of people have done, is suppress the awareness of it so effectively that it stops registering consciously. It doesn't stop being there. It just stops being acknowledged. And then it finds other ways to express itself through anger, through the compulsion pursuit of achievement or status, through the restlessness that won't let you be still, through the low-grade dissatisfaction that nothing quite reaches. The person who doesn't need anyone is almost always the person who needs connection the most. They've just learned somewhere along the way that needing it was dangerous. So they built a version of themselves that doesn't. And they've been maintaining that construction ever since at significant cost. Dismantling it, admitting that the need is real, that the want is real, that you actually want something more than what you've been allowing yourself, is one of the most courageous things a person can do. Because the defense was built to protect something real. Taking it down requires trusting that you can be okay without it. You can be, but you have to decide to find out. Another question. Sit with this one. What are you protecting by keeping things casual? Not what you're avoiding in other people, what you're protecting in yourself. Your heart, maybe. The part of you that got hurt badly enough that you decided this level of exposure was the maximum you were willing to risk again. Your pride, maybe. The unwillingness to be the one who wants something more, who needs, who is vulnerable enough to be rejected at the level that actually matters. Your identity, maybe. The version of yourself that is in control, unbothered, free, untethered. The version that looks like strength from the outside, even if it costs something on the inside. Whatever it is, it made sense at some point. The protection was built for a reason. You learned that this level of exposure was what you could manage. And you arranged your life around managing it. But here's the question that matters. Is what you're protecting still worth what the protection is costing you? Because protection has a cost. The wall keeps things out, but it keeps things in too. And the life you're living inside the wall, is that the life you actually want? Or is it just the life that feels survivable? Those aren't the same thing. I want to be practical here because I think these conversations can stay too abstract and leave people without anything to put, anywhere to put the recognition. If you've heard yourself in this episode, if you recognize the pattern, the callous, the distance, the counterfeit connection, what does moving forward actually look like? The first thing is to stop pretending. Stop performing the identity of someone who doesn't want more than what they're allowing themselves. You don't have to announce it to anyone else. But inside yourself, in the conversation you have when you're completely alone, stop lying about what you actually want. That internal honesty is the foundation of everything that follows. The second thing is to slow down. Not necessarily to stop being sexually active, but to slow down enough to feel what's actually happening. In the moment before you reach for the casual option, pause. What's driving it right now? Is this desire or drive? Is this something you actually want or something you need to make a feeling stop? That question, asked honestly and regularly, starts to create the gap between trigger and response that we talked about in episode 16. The third thing is to practice vulnerability in lower stake contexts first. You don't have to go from fully protected to fully exposed in one move. It's not how the muscle rebuilds. You start small. You tell someone something true that you would normally keep to yourself. You stay in a hard conversation instead of changing the subject. You let someone do something for you instead of insisting you don't need it. Small moments of genuine exposure repeated over time. The fourth thing is to work with someone who can help you understand what the pattern is protecting against. A therapist, a counselor, a life coach, someone who can help you get underneath the behavior to the thing it was building around. Because the pattern makes complete sense once you see the wound it was protecting. And once you see it clearly, you have options you didn't have before. None of this is fast. None of it is comfortable. And all of it is worth it if what you want is a life where you're actually present for your own intimacy. Where you can let someone in past the level that casual sex requires. Where the closeness you're capable of matches the closeness you actually want. I want to close the substantive part of this episode with something important. Nothing in this episode is a judgment on your history. Nothing in this episode is designed to make you feel ashamed of your choices you've made. If you've heard it that way, I want to correct that. The choices you made, the patterns you ran, made sense in the context in which you made them. They were responses to real conditions, real pain, real need, real absence of better options in some cases. You were doing the best you could with what you had. That is true of essentially every person living every pattern we've described in this arc. What I'm offering in this episode is not judgment. It's a mirror. A clear, honest, unflinching mirror. Because the only thing more costly than seeing this clearly is not seeing it at all and continuing the pattern for another decade. You're not broken. You are not damaged beyond repair. You are not defined by the pattern. You are a person who developed a set of strategies for managing a set of needs in conditions that didn't always offer better options. And you have to have the capacity right now, today, with the right support and the right honesty to make different choices. That's the whole point. That has always been the whole point. Last question for this episode, and this is the most important one. What do you actually want? Not what you've told people you want. Not the version that sounds independent and unbothered and free from need. The real version. the honest version. The one you let yourself think about in quiet moments before you reach for something to feel them. Do you want to be genuinely known by someone? To have a person in your life who sees the full version of you and chooses to stay? Do you want to build something, not just experience things, but build something with someone over time? A shared life with weight and history and the kind of trust that only comes from staying through the hard parts. Do you want to wake up next to someone who knows your name and your fears and your history and is still there? Not because you performed well enough the night before, because you built something real enough to hold you both. If the answer to any of those is yes, even quietly, even uncertainly, even underneath a lot of layers of, but I'm fine with the way things are, then you know what the work is. The casual arrangement is not getting you there. It never was. You told yourself it didn't cost you anything. Maybe you still believe that. Maybe this episode hasn't moved that belief yet. That's okay. Truth has its own timeline. It usually arrives when the conditions are right to receive it. But if something in this episode landed, if something I said described something you felt but never had words for, I want you to hold that. Don't dismiss it. Don't rationalize it away. Don't explain it off with, but my situation is different. Sit with it. Because the recognition, the moment you see something clearly that you've been looking past, is a gift. Even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable. That discomfort is information. It's your interior telling you something true. The question is whether you're willing to listen. In the next episode, we're going to talk about open relationships, the conversation nobody's having honestly, not the curated social media version, not the theoretical framework, the real psychological dynamics of what happens when you restructure the rules of intimacy and what it reveals about why you wanted to restructure them in the first place. It's a direct continuation of this arc, so stay with me. I'm Chris Willingham, and this is Without Permission.